Section 4 of 4 Science Fiction Stories by Alan E. Nourse. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Brightside Crossing. James Barron was not pleased to hear that he had had a visitor when he reached the Red Lion that evening. He had no stomach for mysteries, vast or trifling, and there were pressing things to think about at this time. Yet the doorman had flagged him as he came in from the street. "1,000 pardons, Mr. Barron. The gentleman, he would leave no name. He said you'd want to see him. He will be back by 8." Now Barron drummed his fingers on the table top, staring about the quiet lounge. Street trade was discouraged at the Red Lion, gently but persuasively. The patrons were few in number. Across to the right was a group that Barron knew vaguely. Andean climbers, or at least 2 of them were. Over near the door he recognized old Balmer, who had mapped the first passage to the core of the Vulcan crater on Venus. Barron returned his smile with a nod. Then he settled back and waited impatiently for the intruder who demanded his time without justifying it. Presently a small grizzled man across the room sat down at Barron's table. He was short and wiry. His face held no key to his age. He might have been 30 or 1,000, but he looked weary and immensely ugly. His cheeks and forehead were twisted and brown, with scars that were still healing. The stranger said, "I'm glad you waited. I've heard you're planning to attempt the bright side." Barron stared at the man for a moment. "I see you can read telecasts," he said coldly. The news was correct. "We are going to make a brightside crossing." "At Perihelion?" "Of course. When else?" The grizzled man searched Barron's face for a moment without expression. Then he said slowly, "No, I'm afraid you're not going to make the crossing." "Say, who are you, if you don't mind?" Barron demanded. "The name is Claney," said the stranger. There was a silence. Then, "Claney? Peter Claney?" "That's right." Barron's eyes were wide with excitement, all trace of anger gone. "Great balls of fire, man! Where have you been hiding? We've been trying to contact you for months." "I know. I was hoping you'd quit looking and chuck the whole idea." "Quit looking?" Barron bent forward over the table. "My friend, we'd given up hope, but we've never quit looking. Here, have a drink. There's so much you can tell us." His fingers were trembling. Peter Claney shook his head. "I can't tell you anything you want to hear." "But you've got to. You're the only man on Earth who's attempted a brightside crossing and lived through it. And the story you cleared for the news. It was nothing. We need details. Where did your equipment fall down? Where did you miscalculate? What were the trouble spots?" Barron jabbed a finger at Claney's face. "That, for instance. Epithelioma. Why? What was wrong with your glass? Your filters? We've got to know those things. If you can tell us, we can make it across where your attempt failed." "You want to know why we failed?" asked Claney. "Of course we want to know. We have to know." "It's simple. We failed because it can't be done. We couldn't do it and neither can you. No human beings will ever cross the bright side alive, not if they try for centuries." "Nonsense," Barron declared. "We will." Claney shrugged. "I was there. I know what I'm saying. You can blame the equipment or the men. There were flaws in both quarters, but we just didn't know what we were fighting. It was the planet that whipped us, that and the sun. They'll whip you too if you try it." "Never," said Barron. "Let me tell you," Peter Claney said. "I'd been interested in the bright side for almost as long as I can remember," Claney said. "I guess I was about 10 when Wyatt and Carpenter made the last attempt. That was in 2082, I think. I followed the news stories like a Tri-V serial, and then I was heartbroken when they just disappeared. I know now that they were a pair of idiots, starting off without proper equipment, with practically no knowledge of surface conditions, without any charts. They couldn't have made 100 miles, But I didn't know that then, and it was a terrible strategy. After that I followed Sanderson's work in the Twilight Lab up there and began to get Brightside into my blood, sure as death. But it was Macuta's idea to attempt a crossing. Did you ever know Tom Macuta? I don't suppose you did. No, not Japanese, Polish American. He was a major in the Interplanetary Service for some years and hung on to the title after he gave up his commission. He was with Armstrong on Mars during his service days, did a good deal of the original mapping and surveying for the colony there. I first met him on Venus. We spent 5 years together up there doing some of the nastiest exploring since the Matto Grosso. Then he made the attempt on Vulcan crater that paved the way for Balmer a few years later. I'd always liked the major. He was a big and quiet and cool sort of guy, who always had things figured a little further ahead of anyone else and always knew what to do in a tight place. Too many men in this game are all nerve and luck, with no judgment. The major had both. He also had the kind of personality that could take a crew of wild men and make them work like a well-oiled machine across 1,000 miles of Venus jungle. I liked him and I trusted him. He contacted me in New York and he was very casual at first. We spent an evening here at the Red Lion, talking about old times. He told me about the Vulcan business, and how he'd been out to see Sanderson and the Twilight Lab on Mercury, and how he preferred a hot trek to a cold one any day of the year. And then he wanted to know what I'd been doing since Venus and what my plans were. No particular plans, I told him. Why? He looked me over. How much do you weigh, Peter? I told him 135. That much, he said. Well, there can't be much fat on you at any rate. How do you take heat? You should know, I said, Venus was no ice box. No, I mean real heat. Then I began to get it. You're planning a trip. That's right, a hot trip. He grinned at me. Might be dangerous, too. What trip? Bright side of Mercury, the major said. I whistled cautiously. At Aphelion? He threw his head back. Why try a crossing at Aphelion? What have you done then? 4,000 miles of a butcherous heat, just to have some joker come along, use your data and drum you out of the glory by crossing at perihelion 44 days later. No thanks, I want the bright side without any nonsense about it. He leaned across me eagerly. I want to make a crossing at perihelion and I want to cross on the surface. If a man can do that, he's got Mercury. Until then, nobody's got Mercury. I want Mercury, but I'll need help getting it. I'd thought of it 1,000 times and never dared consider it. Nobody had since Wyatt and Carpenter disappeared. Mercury turns on its axis in the same time that it wheels around the sun, which means that the bright side is always facing in. That makes the bright side of Mercury at perihelion the hottest place in the solar system, with one single exception, the surface of the sun itself. It would be a hellish trek. Only a few men had ever learned just how hellish and they never came back to tell about it. It was a real hell's crossing, but someday, I thought, somebody would cross it. I wanted to be along. The Twilight Lab near the northern pole of Mercury was the obvious jumping-off place. The setup there wasn't very extensive. A rocket landing, the labs and quarters for Sanderson's crew sunk deep into the crust, and the tower that housed the solar scope that Sanderson had built up there 10 years before. The Twilight Lab wasn't particularly interested in the bright side, of course. The sun was Sanderson's baby and he'd picked Mercury as the closest chunk of rock to the sun that could hold his observatory. He'd chosen a good location, too. On Mercury, the bright side temperature hits 770 degrees Fahrenheit at perihelion, and the dark side runs pretty constant at minus 410 degrees Fahrenheit. No permanent installation with a human crew could survive at either extreme, but with Mercury's wobble, the twilight zone between bright side and dark side offers something closer to survival temperatures. Sanderson built the lab up near the pole, where the zone is about 5 miles wide, so the temperature only varies 50 to 60 degrees with the libration. The solar scope could take that much change and they'd get a good clear observation of the sun for about 70 out of the 88 days it takes for the planet to wheel around. The major was counting on Sanderson knowing something about Mercury as well as the sun when we camped at the lab to make final preparations. Sanderson did. He thought we'd lost our minds and he said so, but he gave us all the help he could. He spent a week briefing Jack Stone, the third member of our party, who had arrived with the supplies and equipment a few days earlier. Poor Jack met us at the rocket landing almost bawling. Sanderson had given him such a gloomy picture of what Brightside was like. Stone was a youngster, hardly 25, I'd say, but when he'd been with the major at Vulcan and begged to join this trek, I had a funny feeling that Jack really didn't care for exploring too much, but he thought Macuta was God, followed him around like a puppy. It didn't matter to me as long as he knew what he was getting in for. You don't go asking people in this game why they do it. They're liable to get awfully uneasy, and none of them can ever give you an answer that makes sense. Anyway, Stone had borrowed 3 men from the lab, and had the supplies and equipment all lined up when we got there, ready to check and test. We dug right in, with plenty of funds, Tri-V money and some government cash the major had talked his way around. Our equipment was new and good. Macuta had done the designing and testing himself, with a big assist from Sanderson. We had 4 bugs, 3 of them the light pillow tire models, with special lead-cooled cut-in engines when the heat set in, and 1 heavy-duty tractor model for pulling the sledges. The major went over them like a kid at the circus. Then he said, "Have you heard anything from McIvers?" "Who's he?" Stone wanted to know. "He'll be joining us. He's a good man. Got quite a name for climbing back home." The major turned to me. "You've probably heard of him." I'd heard plenty of stories about Ted McIvers, and I wasn't too happy to hear that he was joining us. Kind of a daredevil, isn't he? Maybe. He's lucky and skillful. Where do you want to draw the line? We'll need plenty of both. "Have you ever worked with him?" I asked. "No. Are you worried?" "Not exactly, but Brightside is no place to count on luck." The major laughed. "I don't think we need to worry about McIvers. We understood each other when I talked up the trip to him and we're going to need each other too much to do any fooling around." He turned back to the supply list. "Meanwhile, let's get this stuff listed and packed. We'll need to cut weight sharply and our time is short. Sanderson says we should leave in 3 days. 2 days later, McIvers hadn't arrived. The major didn't say much about it. Stone was getting edgy and so was I. We spent the second day studying charts of the Brightside, such as they were. The best available were pretty poor, taken from so far out that the detail dissolved into blurs on blow-up. They showed the biggest ranges of peaks and craters and faults, and that was all. Still, we could use them to plan a broad outline of our course. "This range here," the major said as we crowded around the board, "is largely inactive, according to Sanderson. But these to the south and west could be active. Seismograph tracings suggest a lot of activity in that region, getting worse down toward the equator, not only volcanic but subsurface shifting." Stone nodded. "Sanderson told me there was probably constant surface activity." The major shrugged. "Well, it's treacherous, there's no doubt of it. But the only way to avoid it is to travel over the pole, which could lose us days, and offer us no guarantee of less activity to the west. Now we might avoid some if we could find a pass through this range and cut sharp east." It seemed that the more we considered the problem, the further we got from a solution. We knew there were active volcanoes on Brightside, even on the dark side, though surface activity there was pretty much slowed down and localized. But there were problems of atmosphere on Brightside as well.